the last parameter that's outlined is that of intensity, namely the minimum and maximum intensities that I can produce at various fundamental frequency levels. So I have 3 recordings of one testing my dynamic range at a low, middle, and high fundamental frequency. Now what we'll notice, without even playing the recording, is that these 4 vocalizations have much less acoustic energy than the rest of these, which have an abundance of acoustic energy, as we can see. So we want to examine the intensity. So what we'll do is we can start over here, and we will go to the intensity tab and measure the maximum intensity. And that gives us about 89.5 decibels. The average endpoints, the average envelope of dynamic range for in your average adult male is about 50 on the low end decibels to about 115 decibels. And as we see, this is lower than 115, but it should be noted that this is in the low part of, it's a low frequency. And when you look at an individual's vocal profile, the margins, that's to say the low and the high frequencies, tend to have a more restricted dynamic range than the more comfortable middle frequencies, which are more often used a little more commonly in conversation. Now, on the low end, we run into a bit of a dilemma in Prot, because if we decide we have this low part highlighted, we get the minimum intensity, it'll tell us about 32. And that is actually not accurate. What that is measuring is the lowest intensity at these intervals at the very ends of these vocalizations, during which the subglottal pressure under my vocal folds is dropping, and so the source of the vibration of the glottal sound itself is dwindling. So what would be more accurate representation of the low end of my dynamic frequency range, and I'll do this for the other 2 as well, is to look at, and these 2 look like they have less acoustic energy than these 2. We can zoom in, capital N. We'll say that this one, just to eyeball it, and we'll highlight part of it like this before it drops off. And we can measure the intensity, get the minimum intensity, and that's 62, which is much more reasonable. And then just very quickly, go to the middle, and we'll do the same here, just to make a comparison. Now here, it's 91 decibels, which is more. It is more than at the low frequencies, but it's still not the average maximum, at least not what's quoted in the book. And either I'm not, in fact, loud enough, or again, as I mentioned, I was sick during these recordings, so it's possible that interfered with my dynamic range. And here, again, just to eyeball it, let's say we'll take this, and we'll get the minimum intensity. This is 66. And so what we're seeing for both this one and for the low frequencies is I am approaching the average dynamic, the average range, and that's to say, 20 to 30 decibels tends to be the usual range, which we did get for both those, and then just for the sake of continuity and completion, we can then view the high frequencies. Intensity tab. Just to get our sense of closure. We see 91 again, and then here we see that these are much louder than in the other 2 instances. Again, I'll just eyeball it. We'll take this one, take the minimum, and we get 72, which is, again, which is much louder than the minimum for the other 2 recordings. And as I mentioned before, that is to be expected. The further on the margins of the dynamic, or rather of the frequency range that you go, the more restricted the dynamic range will be.